The baby's cry pierced the morning air for just a moment before the splash silenced everything. Margaret Whitmore, president of Riverside Estates HOA, stood dripping on the riverbank, her manicured hands trembling as she stared at the ripples spreading across the dark water. Behind her, a young mother's scream shattered the suburban peace. What Margaret didn't know was that her husband had been watching from their bedroom window, and the divorce papers he'd been hiding in his desk drawer where the morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine sidewalks of Riverside Estates, where every lawn was precisely edged and every mailbox stood at regulation height. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her designer sunglasses and checked her watch, 7:47 a.m., 3 minutes behind schedule. As HOA president, punctuality wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. Her heels clicked against the pavement in a steady rhythm as she began her daily inspection rounds. 23 years she'd lived in this neighborhood, and 23 years she'd fought to maintain its standards. The perfectly manicured community was her masterpiece, her legacy, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone destroy it. The first violation presented itself at 412 Maple Drive. Sarah Chen's garden gnome sat defiantly among her prize-winning roses, its ceramic grin mocking the HOA's strict no lawn ornaments policy. Margaret pulled out her tablet and began typing furiously. Violation notice number 1, an authorized decorative item. Fine, $150. Removal deadline, 48 hours. She photographed the gnome from 3 angles, her lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. The Chens would learn, just as the Patels had learned about their wind chimes and the Johnsons about their vegetable garden. 3 houses down, Margaret's attention was drawn to the sound of a baby crying. She looked up to see a young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair struggling to carry a car seat, diaper bag, and grocery bags while trying to quiet her infant. The woman, Margaret didn't recognize her, was heading toward the small rental property at 418 Maple Drive. Margaret's eyes narrowed. The rental house had been empty for months and she'd received no notification of new tenants. More importantly, the woman was clearly violating Section 7.3 of the HOA guidelines: no commercial vehicles, trailers, or temporary structures shall be parked in driveways overnight. The woman had left a small U-Haul trailer hitched to her beat-up Honda Civic. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The young woman turned, bouncing the crying baby gently. Up close, Margaret could see the exhaustion written across her face, dark circles under green eyes, the pallor of someone who hadn't slept in days. She looked to be in her early 20s, far too young to be living in Margaret's neighborhood without proper supervision. "Are you addressing me?" the woman asked, her voice hoarse. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association." "I don't believe we've been introduced." Margaret's tone carried the weight of authority and barely concealed disdain. "I'm Emma Morrison. I just moved into 418 yesterday." Emma shifted the baby to her other arm, trying to reach for her keys. "I'm sorry, but could we talk later?" "My daughter hasn't stopped crying since, Ms. Morrison," Margaret interrupted. "I'm afraid there are several violations that need immediate attention. First, that trailer cannot remain in your driveway. Second, I need to see your lease agreement and verify that you've received proper approval from the HOA board." Emma's face flushed. "I'm sorry, but I'm really not in the mood for this right now. My baby is sick, I haven't slept in 36 hours, and I just need to get inside, and the rules don't pause for personal convenience, Ms. Morrison." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is a respectable neighborhood with standards. Standards that will be maintained regardless of your circumstances." The baby's crying intensified, and Emma's composure finally cracked. "Look, lady, I don't know what your problem is, but I've done nothing wrong. I signed a lease, I paid my deposit, and I have every right to be here. Now if you'll excuse me, you'll find that rights are earned in this community, not assumed." Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the property management company. That trailer better be gone by tonight, or you'll be receiving your first fine." Emma stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked toward her front door without another word. Margaret watched her go, noting the way the young woman's shoulders shook, whether from anger or exhaustion, she didn't care. As Emma disappeared inside, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Richard, it's Margaret. I need you to pull the rental application for 418 Maple Drive." "No, I don't care if it's approved. I want to know everything about this Emma Morrison person." "Yes, immediately." She hung up and continued her rounds, but her mind remained focused on the new resident. There was something about Emma Morrison that unsettled her, a defiance that needed to be crushed before it could spread to other residents. 2 hours later, Margaret sat in her home office, a converted sunroom that overlooked the Riverside Estates community garden. The space was decorated with certificates of appreciation, photos of neighborhood improvement projects, and a prominent display of the HOA's Community Excellence Award from 2019. Her phone buzzed. Richard's text was brief but informative, single. Mother, 22, works nights at St. Mary's Hospital. No criminal record. Lease is legitimate. Father of baby unknown. Margaret smiled. Single mother, working nights, no support system. Perfect. She was interrupted by the sound of voices from the garden below. Through her window, she could see Emma Morrison sitting on a bench near the small pond, gently rocking her baby. The infant had finally stopped crying and seemed to be sleeping peacefully. But what caught Margaret's attention was the small group of neighbors who had gathered around Emma. Sarah Chen was there, along with Mrs. Patterson from down the street and that annoying Johnson woman with her 3 children. They were all cooing over the baby, and Margaret could see Emma actually smiling for the first time. Margaret's jaw tightened. This was how it always started, one person breaking the rules, others rallying around them, and before long, the entire neighborhood's standards would crumble. She'd seen it happen in other communities, and she'd sworn it would never happen in Riverside Estates. Her husband David's voice drifted up from the kitchen below. "Margaret, lunch is ready." In a minute, she called back, never taking her eyes off the scene below. David appeared in the doorway, still wearing his weekend gardening clothes. At 62, he was 3 years older than Margaret, but his gentle demeanor and kind eyes made him seem younger. They'd been married for 35 years, and in all that time, he'd never once challenged her authority in the neighborhood. "What are you watching?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "The new tenant at 418. She's already causing problems." David looked down at the peaceful scene below. "She seems nice. Sarah was telling me her baby was born premature and spent weeks in the NICU. The poor thing's been having trouble sleeping." "That's not my concern." Margaret's voice was ice cold. "My concern is maintaining property values and community standards." "Margaret, she's just a young mother trying to." David. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Don't. We've discussed this. I don't interfere with your hobbies, and you don't interfere with my responsibilities." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded silently and left the room. Margaret turned back to the window, but the group had dispersed. Emma Morrison was walking back toward her house, the baby still sleeping in her arms. That evening, Margaret stood in her kitchen, preparing dinner and planning her next move. The trailer was still in Emma's driveway, which meant she was in direct violation of the HOA's rules. Margaret had already prepared the fine notice and would deliver it personally in the morning. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:30 p.m. Margaret opened it to find Emma Morrison standing on her doorstep, looking nervous but determined. The baby was strapped to her chest in a carrier, wide awake and unusually quiet. "Mrs. Whitmore, I was hoping we could talk." Margaret didn't invite her in. "If this is about the trailer, Ms. Morrison, the rules are non-negotiable. Please, just hear me out." Emma's voice was steady despite the obvious exhaustion. "I called the rental company and they said I have 72 hours to move the trailer. I'm working a double shift at the hospital tonight and tomorrow night to pay for the moving truck. I'll have it gone by Wednesday morning. The rule clearly states 24 hours. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm a nurse, I work nights to pay for childcare during the day, and I'm doing the best I can. I just need a little flexibility." Margaret's expression didn't change. Flexibility is what destroyed the Sunset Hills community. Once you start making exceptions, the entire system collapses. Emma's composure finally cracked. What is wrong with you? I'm asking for 2 extra days to move a trailer, not permission to burn down the neighborhood. Lower your voice, Ms. Morrison. There are noise ordinances. Are you serious right now? Emma's voice rose despite the warning. You're more concerned about noise levels than showing basic human decency. I'm concerned about maintaining the standards that keep this neighborhood desirable. Standards that benefit E. 3 days after the hospital incident, Margaret stood in her kitchen savoring her morning coffee when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a tall woman with auburn hair and sharp green eyes, clearly related to Emma Morrison, but older. More polished and radiating an energy that made Margaret instantly uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitmore. I'm Jessica Morrison, Emma's sister. I was hoping we could have a conversation. Margaret's smile was practiced and cold. I'm afraid I don't have time for social calls. If this is about the violation notices, your sister can address those through proper channels. Oh, this isn't about violation notices. Jessica's smile was equally cold but infinitely more dangerous. This is about a pattern of harassment, potential discrimination, and what my research suggests might be financial improprieties in your HOA's operations. The word research hit Margaret like a physical blow. I'm sorry, what did you say you do for a living? Investigative journalism. I specialize in suburban corruption cases. May I come in? Margaret's instinct was to slam the door, but 30 years of social conditioning kept her frozen in place. I suppose we could talk for a few minutes. Jessica stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the house with professional interest. Margaret led her to the living room, noting how the woman's gaze lingered on the numerous HOA awards and certificates covering the walls. Impressive collection, Jessica said, settling into an armchair. 23 years as HOA president. That's quite a tenure. The residents keep electing me because I get results. Interesting. According to the county records, there haven't been any contested elections in Riverside Estates since 2018. In fact, you've been running unopposed for the past 3 terms. Margaret's jaw tightened. People are satisfied with my leadership. Or perhaps they're afraid to challenge you. Jessica pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through notes. I've been doing some research since Emma told me about your interactions. Did you know that Riverside Estates has the highest turnover rate of any HOA community in the county? Families move out after an average of 18 months. People have different needs and the highest rate of HOA violations and fines. In fact, your community generates more violation revenue than the next 3 HOAs combined. Jessica's green eyes were laser-focused. That's unusual, don't you think? Margaret stood abruptly. I think this conversation is over. Your sister broke the rules and she's facing the consequences. If you have legal concerns, I suggest you consult an attorney. Oh, I have consulted attorneys. Several, actually. Jessica remained seated, unperturbed. Did you know that under state law, HOA boards are required to maintain detailed financial records and make them available to residents upon request? Emma submitted that request yesterday. The books are perfectly in order. I'm sure they are. But I'm particularly interested in the line item 4, community enhancement projects, that's consumed nearly 60% of your budget over the past 5 years. That's a lot of enhancement for a neighborhood that looks exactly the same as it did in 2019. Margaret's face had gone pale. Those are legitimate expenditures, I'm sure they are. Like the $15,000 for landscaping consultation paid to Whitmore Garden Services. Interesting coincidence in the name, don't you think? The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret's mind raced, trying to remember exactly what David had told her about keeping the business separate from HOA funds. That's a completely different company, Margaret said finally. Of course it is. Just like the $8,000 for security assessment paid to DW Consulting, David Whitmore's initials, I assume. And the monthly payments to Pristine Property Management, which happens to be registered to your home address. Margaret's hands began to shake. You're making accusations without proof. I'm making observations. The proof will come from the financial records Emma requested. Speaking of which, you have 5 business days to provide those records, or the State HOA Oversight Committee will compel you to do so. Jessica stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden. Your husband seems like a nice man. I met him yesterday when I was visiting Emma. He was very helpful, very forthcoming about the neighborhood's history. What did he tell you? Enough. Jessica turned back to Margaret. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop harassing my sister. You're going to rescind those ridiculous violation notices. And you're going to start treating the residents of this community with basic human decency. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. And if I don't, then my article about corruption in Riverside Estates will run in next Sunday's paper, complete with financial records, resident testimonials, and a detailed account of how you refused to help a young mother get her sick baby to the hospital. You have no proof of. I have David's statement. He saw everything from your living room window. He's very concerned about your behavior, Margaret. Very concerned. Margaret's legs gave out and she sank onto the sofa. David wouldn't. He wouldn't betray me like that. He's not betraying you. He's trying to save you from yourself. Jessica's voice softened slightly. Look, I don't want to destroy your life. I want to protect my sister and fix this community. But if you keep pushing, I'll have no choice but to push back harder. After Jessica left, Margaret sat in her living room for nearly an hour, staring at the awards and certificates that had once filled her with pride. The sound of the front door opening startled her from her thoughts. Margaret. David's voice carried a note of concern. Are you all right? You look pale. She looked up at her husband, really looked at him, for the first time in months. When had he gotten so many grey hairs? When had those lines appeared around his eyes? David, we need to talk. He sat beside her on the sofa, and for a moment, they were just 2 people who had shared 35 years of marriage. Then Margaret's training kicked in, and she became the woman who had controlled this neighborhood for over 2 decades. That woman, Emma's sister, she was here making threats and accusations. She's trying to destroy everything we've built. David's face remained carefully neutral. What kind of accusations? Financial improprieties. Harassment. Complete nonsense, but she's threatening to go to the press. Margaret grabbed his hand. David, I need you to support me on this. We're a team, remember? He was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, do you remember why we moved here? What does that have to do with anything? We moved here because we wanted to raise our family in a safe, friendly neighborhood. We wanted community, connection, neighbors who looked out for each other. And that's exactly what I've created. No, Margaret. That's what you've destroyed. David pulled his hand away. When was the last time we were invited to a neighborhood barbecue? When was the last time someone stopped by just to say hello? People respect authority, people fear you. His voice was quiet but firm. I've watched you turn this place into a police state, and I've watched you turn into someone I don't recognize. Margaret's composure cracked. How can you say that? Everything I've done has been for this community, for us, for our property. Values. Emma Morrison asked me for help getting her baby to the hospital, and I found out later that she'd asked you first. You refused to help a sick infant, Margaret. What kind of person does that? I had responsibilities, you had a choice. David's voice rose for the first time in years. You chose to let a baby suffer because you were more concerned about maintaining your authority than showing basic human compassion. Margaret stared at him, recognizing something in his eyes she'd never seen before, disappointment so deep it felt like hatred. David, please. Let's not fight about this. We can handle Jessica Morrison together, just like we've handled everything else. There is no we anymore, Margaret. There hasn't been for years. He stood up and walked toward the stairs. I'm going to pack some things. I'll be staying at my brother's for a while. David, wait, I'm done waiting, Margaret. I'm done watching you hurt people. I'm done being married to someone who's forgotten how to be human. He was halfway up the stairs when Margaret called out, "If you leave me now, I'll never forgive you." David paused and turned back. "That's the difference between us, Margaret. I forgave you a long time ago. I just can't enable you anymore." The sound of his footsteps on the stairs echoed through the house like gunshots. Margaret sat in the living room, surrounded by her awards and certificates, and for the first time in decades, she felt truly alone. But Margaret Whitmore hadn't maintained control of Riverside Estates for 23 years by giving up easily. If Jessica Morrison wanted a war, she'd give her one. And Emma Morrison, that little girl who thought she could waltz into this neighborhood and disrupt everything, was about to learn what happened to people who challenged Margaret's authority. The next morning, Margaret stood in her office reviewing the neighborhood covenant documents with microscopic attention. There had to be something, some clause, some regulation, that she could use to force Emma Morrison out of Riverside Estates permanently. She found it in Section 12.7, Quiet Hours and Noise Disturbance Policies. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. Emma worked night shifts, which meant she slept during the day. The baby cried during the day. Technically, that constituted a noise disturbance during quiet hours, which Margaret sat in the sterile interrogation room at the Riverside Police Department, her designer suit feeling like armor that had failed to protect her. Detective Sarah Chen, the same Sarah Chen whose garden gnome had been Margaret's first violation of the morning that started this nightmare, sat across from her with a thick file folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, let's start with the financial records." Detective Chen opened the folder, revealing bank statements, invoices, and transaction reports. "We've been working with the State HOA Oversight Committee, and there are some discrepancies we need to discuss." Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I don't understand why you're investigating legitimate business expenses." "Because Whitmore Garden Services, DW Consulting, and Pristine Property Management are all registered to your personal address, but the invoices show payments for services that were never performed." Detective Chen spread the documents across the table. "For example, this $15,000 payment for landscaping consultation was supposedly for redesigning the community garden. But the garden looks exactly the same as it did 3 years ago. The consultation determined that no changes were necessary. A $15,000 consultation to determine that nothing needed to be done." Detective Chen's voice carried the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many weak explanations. "And this $8,000 for security assessment by DW Consulting, what exactly did your husband assess?" Margaret's hands began to tremble. "David evaluated the neighborhood's security vulnerabilities and recommended improvements. Such as enhanced lighting and patrol protocols." "Mrs. Whitmore, we've spoken to every resident in Riverside Estates. Not one of them has seen any security improvements, enhanced lighting, or patrol protocols. What they have seen is a systematic campaign of harassment against anyone who questions your authority." Detective Chen pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a comprehensive report. "In the past 5 years, you've forced out the Henderson family after fining them $3,000 for a vegetable garden. The Patel family moved after you threatened to foreclose on their home over wind chimes. The Rodriguez family, no relation to Officer Rodriguez, sold their house at a loss after you imposed daily fines for a children's playhouse that met all local building codes." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Those families violated community standards." "No, Mrs. Whitmore. Those families threatened your control, so you destroyed them financially and emotionally until they had no choice but to leave." Detective Chen leaned forward. "The pattern is clear, and it's been going on for years. Emma Morrison isn't your first victim, she's just the first one who fought back." The interrogation continued for 3 hours. With each question, each document, each recorded statement from former residents, Margaret's world crumbled further. The financial fraud was extensive. Over $200,000 in HOA funds had been diverted to fake companies over the past 5 years. The harassment campaign had driven away dozens of families, and the intimidation tactics had created a climate of fear that had gone unreported until now. When Margaret finally left the police station, she found Jessica Morrison waiting in the parking lot. "Rough day?" Jessica asked, her voice deceptively casual. Haven't you done enough damage? I haven't even gotten started. Jessica fell into step beside Margaret as they walked toward the parking garage. The financial fraud charges are just the beginning. I've been interviewing former residents and their stories are heartbreaking. The young couple who lost their first home because you fined them into foreclosure over a disability ramp. The elderly man who moved to a nursing home because you made his life so miserable he couldn't bear to stay in his own house. Margaret stopped walking. You don't understand what it takes to maintain a community like Riverside Estates. I understand perfectly. It takes a sociopath with delusions of grandeur and a complete absence of empathy. Jessica's voice was cold as winter steel. But here's what you don't understand: Emma isn't just my sister. She's also one of the most determined people I've ever met. And after what you put her through, she's not going to stop until you're destroyed. What does that mean? It means that while you were sitting in that interrogation room, Emma was attending the emergency HOA board meeting that your neighbors called to discuss your removal from office. Margaret's face went white. That's impossible. I am the board. I've been president for 23 years. Actually, according to the original HOA charter, the board consists of 5 elected residents and the president serves at the pleasure of the board. You've been operating outside your authority for years and the residents have finally figured it out. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a live video feed. Emma's streaming the meeting. Would you like to watch? On the screen, Margaret could see the community center packed with residents she'd terrorized, intimidated, and driven away over the years. And standing at the podium, holding baby Lily in one arm while addressing the crowd, was Emma Morrison. Margaret Whitmore has stolen from this community, not just financially, but emotionally, Emma was saying. She's stolen our sense of neighborhood, our feeling of safety, our basic human dignity. But tonight, we take it back. The crowd erupted in applause. Margaret watched in horror as one by one, residents stood up to share their stories. Mrs. Patterson talked about being fined for having flowers that were the wrong color. The Johnson family described how Margaret had tried to have their disabled son's therapy equipment removed as an eyesore. Dozens of other residents recounted years of harassment, financial abuse, and psychological terrorism. This isn't legal, Margaret whispered. Actually, it is. Emma found the original HOA documents in the county records. You've been operating under fraudulent authority for years. Jessica smiled grimly. The vote to remove you was unanimous. The vote to elect Emma as interim president was also unanimous. And the vote to pursue criminal charges against you was, well, you get the idea. Margaret grabbed Jessica's arm. Please, I can make this right. I can pay back the money, I can change. You had your chance to change when you refused to help a sick baby. You had your chance when you chose to escalate instead of showing basic human decency. Jessica pulled her arm free. Now you get to face the consequences. As they reached Margaret's car, Jessica handed her a thick envelope. Your copy of the restraining order. You're not allowed within 500 feet of Emma, her daughter, or any HOA property. You're also banned from attending any community meetings or events. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear: she was being exiled from the community she'd controlled for over 2 decades. This is my neighborhood, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I built this place. I made it what it is. Yes, you did. You turned it into a prison where people were afraid to plant flowers or let their children play outside. Congratulations on your legacy. Margaret drove home in a daze, the restraining order sitting on her passenger seat like a death sentence. When she pulled into her driveway, she saw David loading boxes into his truck. Going somewhere, she asked, her voice hollow. I told you I was staying at my brother's. David didn't look at her as he continued loading his belongings. I came back for more of my things. David, please. I know today was difficult, but we can get through this together. No, Margaret. We can't. He finally turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before: pity. I've been talking to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. David closed the tailgate of his truck. I can't be married to someone who's capable of what you've done to this community, to Emma, to that baby. I never hurt the baby, you refused to help a sick infant because you were more concerned about maintaining your authority than showing basic human compassion. If you can't understand why that's unforgivable, then you're even more lost than I thought. Margaret grabbed his arm. David, please. I'll change. I'll get help. I'll do whatever you want. What I want is to be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. I've enabled your behavior for years and I'm done. He gently removed her hand from his arm. I'm sorry, Margaret. I really am. But this is over. She watched him drive away, standing in her driveway like a statue until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she walked into her empty house and sat in her living room, surrounded by the awards and certificates that had once meant everything to her. The silence was overwhelming. For the first time in decades, there were no violation notices to write, no fines to calculate, no neighbors to intimidate. There was just Margaret, alone with the wreckage of everything she'd built and destroyed. She was still sitting there when the doorbell rang at 11 p.m. Margaret opened the door to find Officer Rodriguez standing on her doorstep. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but we have a situation. Several residents have reported seeing you walking around the neighborhood after dark, which would be a violation of your restraining order. Margaret's face flushed. I was just taking a walk to clear my head. I didn't go near Emma Morrison's house. The restraining order prohibits you from being on any HOA property. Margaret woke up on her living room couch at dawn, her laptop still open on her chest, displaying detailed notes about Emma Morrison's schedule, habits, and vulnerabilities. The morning light streaming through her windows revealed the truth of her situation. She was a 60-year-old woman plotting revenge against a 22-year-old single mother, and she no longer cared how that looked. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. Court hearing moved to 2 p.m. today. Financial fraud charges formally filed. Recommend immediate plea negotiations. Margaret deleted the message without responding. She had bigger concerns than legal proceedings. She showered and dressed in her most professional outfit, armor for the battle ahead. As she applied her makeup, Margaret studied her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back had the same perfectly coiffed hair and expensive cosmetics, but something fundamental had changed. The mask of suburban respectability had slipped, revealing something darker underneath. At 8:30 a.m., Margaret positioned herself at her bedroom window with binoculars, watching Emma's house from behind her curtains. She knew Emma's schedule by heart now. Night shift ended at 7 a.m., home by 7:30, baby fed and changed by 8:15, both asleep by 9 a.m. Emma would wake up around 3 p.m., take the baby for a walk around 4 p.m., then prepare for another night shift. Margaret's observations were interrupted by the sound of voices from the garden below. She looked down to see a group of neighbors gathered around Emma, who was holding Lily while addressing what appeared to be an impromptu community meeting. Security company will be installing cameras at all entrances and common areas, Emma was saying. Given recent events, we need to ensure everyone feels safe in their own neighborhood. Margaret's blood pressure spiked. Security cameras meant surveillance, which meant her movements would be monitored and recorded. The new HOA board was already implementing changes designed to limit her options. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. What about the financial situation? How bad is the damage? Bad, Emma replied honestly. We are looking at approximately $200,000 in missing funds over 5 years. We've filed insurance claims and are working with investigators to recover what we can, but realistically, we may need to implement special assessments to cover necessary repairs and improvements that were never completed despite being paid for. The crowd murmured angrily. Margaret watched as her former subjects turned their fury toward her empty house, some pointing and shaking their heads. She was being erased from her own community, transformed from leader to pariah in less than a week. The good news, Emma continued, is that we are finally free to be the kind of neighborhood we always wanted to be. No more arbitrary fines, no more harassment, no more living in fear. We are going to rebuild this community based on mutual respect and genuine care for one another." The applause that followed felt like a knife twisting in Margaret's chest. This was her neighborhood, her creation, her legacy, and now they were celebrating its destruction. Margaret grabbed her car keys and headed for the garage. Restraining order or not, she wasn't going to hide in her house while Emma Morrison poisoned her neighbors against her. She had business to attend to, starting with Emma's employer. St. Mary's Hospital was a sprawling complex 20 minutes from Riverside Estates. Margaret had never set foot inside, but she'd researched it thoroughly during her night of planning. Emma worked in the neonatal intensive care unit, taking care of premature babies, the ultimate irony given Margaret's accusations about her own baby being a noise disturbance. Margaret parked in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She'd learned long ago that authority was mostly about presentation and attitude. The information desk was staffed by a tired-looking volunteer who barely looked up when Margaret approached. "I need to speak with someone in hospital administration about one of your employees," Margaret said in her most official tone. "What kind of concern?" "A very serious one involving child endangerment and professional misconduct." 20 minutes later, Margaret sat across from Janet Morrison, no relation to Emma, the hospital's human resources director, in a sterile office overlooking the parking lot. "You're saying that Emma Morrison is bringing her infant to work?" Janet asked, reviewing the notes she'd taken during Margaret's carefully crafted story. "Not just bringing her to work, exposing her to dangerous environments, leaving her unattended while she works, and creating safety hazards for other patients." Margaret's voice carried the perfect blend of concern and authority. "I'm a long-time resident of her neighborhood, and I felt it was my civic duty to report this situation. These are very serious allegations. Do you have any proof?" Margaret handed over printed photographs she'd taken from her window, images of Emma carrying Lily in her car seat, walking to her car in scrubs, returning home in the early morning. Taken out of context, they could be interpreted as evidence of her claims. "As you can see, she's clearly bringing the child to and from work regularly. Given that she works in the NICU with vulnerable premature infants, this represents a significant infection control risk." Janet studied the photos with growing concern. "I'll need to investigate this immediately. If these allegations are true, Emma could face disciplinary action up to and including termination." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. Without her job, Emma would have no way to pay rent, no way to support her daughter, no choice but to leave Riverside Estates. Problem solved. "I trust you'll handle this with appropriate discretion," Margaret said, standing to leave. "I have no personal animosity toward Ms. Morrison, I'm simply concerned about the welfare of the children in your care." Margaret was walking back to her car when her phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number. "Margaret, where are you? Your lawyer has been trying to reach you all morning. I'm handling some personal business. You need to get to the courthouse. The prosecutor is offering a plea deal, but it expires at noon." Margaret glanced at her watch, 11:47 a.m. "What kind of deal?" "Full restitution, 5 years probation, community service." "Margaret, you need to take this. If you go to trial, you're looking at 10 to 15 years in prison. Let me call you back." Margaret hung up and sat in her car, weighing her options. Accept the plea deal and admit guilt, destroying any chance of returning to power in Riverside Estates. Or fight the charges and risk everything on a trial that she'd probably lose. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Stop now or face the consequences." Margaret's hands began to shake. Someone was watching her, tracking her movements, threatening her. The paranoia that had been building for days suddenly crystallized into pure rage. Emma Morrison wasn't content with destroying Margaret's life, she wanted to terrorize her, break her spirit completely. Margaret started her car and drove home, her mind racing with fury and desperation. She'd missed the plea deadline, probably ensuring her eventual imprisonment, but she no longer cared about legal consequences. Emma Morrison had declared war, and Margaret was going to finish it. She arrived home to find a news van parked across the street. Margaret recognized the reporter standing on the sidewalk, Channel 7's investigative team, probably working on a story about HOA corruption. Another knife in her back, courtesy of Jessica Morrison's media connections. Margaret pulled into her garage and slammed the door, shutting out the camera crew and the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Inside her house, she paced frantically, her carefully controlled facade finally cracking completely. At 3:15 p.m., Margaret positioned herself at her window and watched Emma emerge from her house with Lily strapped to her chest. The afternoon walk. Right on schedule. Emma moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd won a war, pausing to chat with neighbors, accepting their congratulations and support. Margaret's vision blurred with rage. Emma Morrison was destroying everything she'd built, and she was enjoying it. She was parading around like a conquering hero while Margaret rotted in exile, alone and defeated. The sight of Emma laughing with Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's own former victim, was the final breaking point. Margaret grabbed her car keys and headed for the garage. Restraining order be damned. She was going to confront Emma Morrison face to face and end this nightmare once and for all. Margaret drove slowly through the neighborhood, careful to avoid the security cameras she knew were being installed. She parked 3 blocks away and walked through the wooded area that bordered the community, approaching Emma's house from behind. Emma was in the community garden with Lily, kneeling beside the small pond while the baby slept in her carrier. The scene was peaceful, domestic, everything Margaret had once believed she was protecting. Now it just looked like a mockery of her lost authority. Margaret emerged from the trees and walked across the garden, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Emma looked up as she approached, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally determination. "You're violating your restraining order," Emma said quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. "You destroyed my life." Margaret's voice was barely controlled. 23 years I spent building this community, making it perfect, and you destroyed it in a week. I didn't destroy anything. I exposed what you really were. What I really was. Margaret's voice rose. I was the only thing standing between